What's going on with the DOGE? Did Trump's threat of tariffs on Colombia prove that tariffs work? And who really are union workers in the United States? I'm Dominic Pino, Thomas L. Rhodes Journalism Fellow with the National Review Institute, and we'll look through those questions on this episode of Econception. Econception is a podcast of the American Institute for Economic Research that looks at the economic issues of the day and the broader economic concepts behind them. We're recording today on location from the DOGE, which is really the friends we made along the way. With President Trump's return to the White House, one of the topics of conversation has been reforming the bureaucracy, reforming the administrative state, trying to cut regulations. One of the things that the administration has said it will do on that front is establish the Department of Government Efficiency, called DOGE, as a sort of joke about Elon Musk's favorite cryptocurrency. I wanted to talk about DOGE, about what is going on with that, and some changes that have happened in the last little bit since the administration has come into office. And to do that, I wanted to talk to James Broughel of the Competitive Enterprise Institute. He is a senior fellow there. He studies regulatory policy and is an authority on all things regulation. So thanks for being here, James.
Thanks for having me.
So I guess to start off, what was the original idea for DOGE? We know that Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy were originally tapped to lead this group. They wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal late last year, sort of outlining what the plan was supposed to be. Can you talk first about what that was?
Sure. So, this was an idea that was first floated by Elon Musk, I'd say last summer, this idea for some kind of government efficiency commission. I've done a lot of work at the state level looking at regulatory reform. So I've seen commissions of various kinds created over the years. New Jersey has one that comes to mind under Chris Christie, which did reviews of the regulatory code. That was kind of initially what I thought maybe that they had in mind. And then when Trump actually won the election, it became clear that Vivek Ramaswamy and Elon Musk were going to head this commission. Initially, they were saying it was going to be external to the government, which raised questions about what is this entity? Is it going to have any authority to tell anyone in the government to do anything or cut spending, et cetera? And yes, they had this op-ed in the Wall Street Journal. They claimed they were going to cut spending by $2 trillion. They said they were going to try to use various court cases related to Chevron deference or the major questions doctrine, which are basically some legal concepts that have come up in Supreme Court cases in recent years. And they were going to use this as basically authority to make sweeping reforms across the government. And so I would say just in general, they've had very grand ambitions about what they want to do in terms of spending, in terms of regulations, in terms of staffing. And we've seen in the last week or so, a lot of those ambitions tailor back quite a bit.
Yeah, so one of the things that has changed between then and now is that Vivek Ramaswamy has apparently been pushed out. He's going to go run for governor of Ohio. And so Elon Musk is the guy in charge now. And we've seen from some reporting about their different visions is that a lot of that stuff about litigation and court cases was Ramaswamy's idea. And Elon Musk is more interested in the tech side of things, which sort of makes sense given his career background. And so what have they done since taking office to actually establish DOGE in the government?
Right. So President Trump issued an executive order that created the DOGE office. And it became clear about a week before he came into office that DOGE was not going to be external to the government. It was going to be internal to the government. So there's a New York Times article that kind of laid some of this out. I guess they had access to some insiders who made this clear. And I suspect one of the reasons for that is they didn't want to run afoul of various laws about advisory commissions, and this would have restricted the kind of information that they could get access to, or might have subject them to various ethical, requirements. And so I suspect it was just a lot easier to make DOGE part of the government. So the executive order basically just took an existing office, this U.S. Digital Service, and renamed it the U.S. DOGE Service. The U.S. Digital Service was something that the Obama administration had created. This was after the kind of chaos that ensued surrounding healthcare.gov and the Obamacare website crashing when it was initially rolled out. And so in response to that, Obama had created this office to basically modernize technology across the federal government. And that office has now been basically renamed DOGE. And interestingly, its mission hasn't really changed, at least according to the executive order that Trump issued. It basically says that the DOGE office is going to have some staff inserted at the various federal agencies, but its mission is to basically modernize technology and upgrade software and upgrade networks and so forth. And that's, according to the executive order, what DOGE is tasked with doing, which is a far cry from cutting spending by $2 trillion or, taming the administrative state, which was what Vivek Ramaswamy in particular was interested in doing. And I know just from news articles, it appears that this is closer to Elon Musk's vision, which is basically using technology in some capacity to try to reform government.
Yeah, I think doing that would still be good. I think that's still a positive thing. There's lots of stuff that needs to be modernized in the government on the technology front, but like you said, that's a big difference from what was initially promised. What do you think? Do you think this was a case of them sort of running up against reality on what was possible and how much you could actually cut? I mean, cutting $2 trillion from the budget, that annual spending is about six trillion, approaching 7 trillion. So $2 trillion of that is a huge chunk, and they wanted to do it without ever touching the largest spending programs, which are entitlement programs and the military.
Right. So I think there's a couple of possibilities. One possibility is just that they were basically ran into reality and had to tailor back the scope of what they were trying to achieve. And another is just that they never really intended on doing those things in the first place. So as you mentioned, I mean, I think when Musk and Ramaswamy were talking about $2 trillion in spending, they were a bit vague about it. So it wasn't clear whether they're talking about annual spending or just $2 trillion in general. But even so, cutting $2 trillion from the federal budget, even over 10 years, is pretty hard to do, especially if you're trying to avoid going after entitlement programs like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. And of course, DOGE doesn't have any authority to cut any spending from those programs anyway. So that's going to be pretty difficult. The other thing is some of these court cases that they were citing actually make it harder for them to cut regulations. So Chevron basically says that courts won't defer to the agency's interpretation of its statutory authority when the statute is vague. Well, that's going to make it harder to issue new regulations, but it's also going to make it harder to issue regulations that are repealing regulations. And you have to go through the rulemaking process in order to remove regulations from the books. So the Trump administration won't get that deference. They won't get, and this issue of the major questions doctrine, if they're trying to sort of push the bounds of what they can achieve administratively or through executive action, then the courts might take a more skeptical eye to any actions they're taking if they're trying to push the bounds of their legal authority. So I think that there were quite a few news stories in the last few months that basically said, where experts were saying it's unclear DOGE is going to be able to accomplish anything even close to what they're talking about. And so that probably contributed to some extent to them basically just tailoring back the mission to this very narrow focus on technology. The other thing I would say is that what concerns me a little bit are just potential conflicts that Elon Musk might have in this area. I mean, he has this company, XAI. It's an AI company. He's been talking about using AI in the government to basically identify wasteful programs. I mean, is the whole idea here just to, get contracts for his company so that federal agencies will use his technology? You mentioned that the DOGE is named after a cryptocurrency, that he's involved in. So, there's just this appearance at a minimum that this is kind of like a scheme to boost some of his investments. I'm not saying that's the only factor. It could just be that they ran again into like these legal realities, and that's all there is to it. But at least there's appearance of some conflicts here that at least make me a little uncomfortable.
Sure. And one of the, I think, fundamental problems that people don't get about regulation is exactly what you were saying, that in order to repeal a rule, you have to go through the same process that you did to make the rule in the first place. And so there's a sort of status quo bias because it's a lot of work to go through that process. And so making it just as difficult to get rid of old rules as it is to pass new ones means that a bunch of rules that might not be relevant anymore, that might not be even based on correct information anymore, that were adopted decades ago, just sit around on the statute books or in the administrative code. And so this accumulates over time into this giant regulatory burden. What are some ideas that we could be doing at the federal level to remedy that problem, to make it easier to get rid of old, outdated rules, while still making it, while still keeping a process in place that doesn't make it super easy to add new ones?
Right. So those are all great points. And I think that's the crux of a big problem with a lot of conservative proposals for regulatory reform is that, yes, they make it harder to issue regulations, but they also make it harder to deregulate. And I think that's the case with reforms to Chevron deference. It's the case with something like the REINS Act, which is an idea to get Congress to vote on all the regulations and you need congressional approval in order for big regulatory actions to go through. All of that, yes, will make it harder to regulate, but will also make it harder to deregulate, and basically has the effect of locking in the status quo, which, most people aren't that happy with as far as the way that Washington works. So, what we really need is a system that says we're going to apply a lot of scrutiny to regulations up front, but we're going to make it very easy to rescind them when they aren't working. And let's face it, we shouldn't expect most regulations to work. Most businesses fail, right? And they have much better market signals, prices, profits. They have things that they can follow to tell them whether their business is working or not. Whereas the federal government issues policies and basically there's very little feedback and the policies just continue and don't change. And so we should expect the overwhelming majority of regulations don't work and don't achieve their objectives and probably have costs in excess of benefits. So we should want to make it easy to rescind those, and we should apply scrutiny to them periodically so that we can assess whether they're working or not. And so this is one reason why I'm a fan of sunset provisions, which are automatic expiration dates built into regulations. Now, there's different ways you can structure sunset provisions. Some ways of setting them up are more effective than others. I don't think it's a cure-all. It's not a silver bullet for solving all of our regulatory problems, but it does kind of flip this dynamic where it says the regulation automatically expires. And when it's up for expiration, you force it back through a very rigorous process where regulations have to be justified. They have to demonstrate, a problem exists that they're solving, or that there are substantive benefits that outweigh the costs. That's the kind of thing where I think you can basically have a regulatory system that's a little more balanced than what we have now, where the effect is basically just that the regulatory code grows every year and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And it's currently almost 190,000 pages in the Code of Federal Regulations. And that's because it's hard to repeal regulations. It's not hard enough to put them in place. And part of this is just interest group dynamics. The interest groups lobby to keep the regulations in place. They may not like them at first, but that once they're in effect, they act as a barrier to entry, and they'll argue that those should be kept. So the business community sometimes opposes sunset provisions for this reason. They'll say, hey, we fought really hard to put all these regulations in place that benefit us, and we don't really want them reviewed. So I think that's one potential solution.
Yeah, you bring up how the regulatory code grows every year. CEI puts out a great number, which is how many regulations are made per law that Congress passes in a year. And it's just this crazy discrepancy between the number of laws that Congress passes, which has been going down in recent years, and the number of regulations which keeps going up. And there's a similar problem in Congress, which is that, in order to pass legislation, you need to get 60 votes in the Senate, which makes it very difficult because it's very rare for one party to have 60 votes. So most laws that pass require at least some cross-partisan support. But that has the same problem there, which is that you also need 60 votes to repeal a law. And so we also have old laws that are still on the books that we could get rid of, but we don't because it's just as difficult to repeal them as it is to pass them. And so I definitely think there needs to be some kind of reform there, because there's no natural reason why the number of laws and regulations should grow every year. Right? Maybe they should go down sometimes. Maybe they should go up sometimes. But there's no reason for it to just continually go up. One of the areas that you mentioned earlier is states. You've worked on issues in a couple different states. As usual, with lots of different issues, the states seem to have a better handle on this than the federal government does. At least some of the states do. Could you give some examples from the state level that could help the federal government to do better?
Sure. So just real quick, I looked it up while you were speaking. The Unconstitutionality Index, which is something Wayne Cruz does at CEI, is the measure of rules versus laws. And so in 2024, he found 3,248 agency rules versus 175 laws. That's 19 regulations for every law. So it gives you a sense that most of the law coming from the federal government, coming from Washington, actually comes from these executive agencies. It's not coming from Congress, which is where you might expect. So, I think that this growth of regulation it's utterly irrational. I mean, it is nonsensical to think that people can comply with 190,000 pages of federal regulations. And the idea that some people think that's perfectly fine is just strange to me. I can't comprehend the mindset that says it's okay for anyone to be able to, or even possible for anyone to even comply with so many regulations at once. But a lot of people seem to think that the status quo is good, or we need even more regulations. So what do I know? But so I think what we need is very concrete, direct goals to reduce the regulatory burden. And so I think we need sweeping goals, like a goal to cut regulations by 30% or to cut 50,000 pages from the Code of Federal Regulations. And I think absent that, we're probably not going to achieve any goals on that order. And states are actually doing that. I mean, there's an executive order from Indiana that came out like 2 weeks ago that has a 25% reduction goal in it for their regulatory rules. And Virginia had a similar executive order that they've been implementing throughout the Youngkin administration. And that I think they're on track to hit their 25% reduction goal. Another state that has gotten quite a bit of attention is Idaho, which underwent a really pretty dramatic regulatory reform in 2019. So they have kind of an interesting arrangement there where every year the legislature votes on whether to keep the regulatory code, whether to allow the administrative rule book to continue for another year. So it's basically a 1-year sunset provision that applies to the entire administrative code. Now, I wouldn't say this kind of policy is perfect. Most years they just reauthorize, and there's not a lot of thought that goes into it necessarily. But what was interesting was that in 2019, somehow this issue, this renewal or reauthorization became kind of a political football, and the House and the Senate were fighting there over some other issues. And basically they left town at the end of session without having reauthorized the administrative code because they couldn't come to agreement on something. And so this initially created a sense of panic, like, oh my God, what's going to happen? All of our regulations are going to disappear. But pretty quickly, I think what they realized was Brad Little, who's the governor, he's still the governor there, they realized, hey, this actually creates a pretty great opportunity for us to basically comb through all the rules, decide which rules we want to keep, which rules we have to keep, and then basically let everything else expire. And so as a result, and this was really kind of a sunset provision, I would say, working as intended, they allowed something like a third of the rules in the rule book. It depends how you measure it, pages or, the number of regulations, et cetera. But somewhere between like 20 and 40% of the regulatory code was eliminated basically overnight in 2019. And, the sky didn't fall. A lot of what they got rid of was pretty uncontroversial. Like, there were regulations about like snail, licenses and things like that, or like uniforms for, certain bureaucrats and like things that were really pretty ridiculous. But, so it's not the air regulations they're eliminating. It's not the water regulations. And of course they couldn't do that anyway, because that's all required by federal law, by state law. But they were able to clean house essentially and do some spring cleaning, let the regulatory code, let a lot of these unnecessary rules that have piled up over the years sunset. And so I think that demonstrates, I'd like to see the federal government do something similar. And I mean, I think there are ways it could, even just through executive actions, you could do something like that, follow the Idaho model, because it was pretty aggressive and it seems to have worked.
It seems like there's something going on in the I states, because you mentioned Indiana and Idaho, but Iowa is another positive example. Can you talk a little bit about what they did there?
Let me think. So I know I wrote about some permitting work. Is that maybe that? Yeah. So I was a visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution last year. So I've been doing a bunch of reports on different permitting reforms that states have adopted. And the Iowa, they've been incorporating something called LEAN, which is a management reform system. So this comes from the private sector, actually, which is in Toyota in particular, has this basically review process that they have managers go through, where they apply scrutiny to different programs in order to find efficiencies, clear out programs that aren't working, and so forth. And so this private sector management reform model has been adopted by some state government agencies and also federal agencies like EPA. And so Iowa has, for the last 2 decades, at its environmental department in particular, basically undergone these lean management reviews on a pretty recurring basis, looking at different programs, finding waste, cutting down permitting times, approval times. And it seems to have been pretty successful. And it's been highlighted in certain federal reports from EPA and so forth. And so some of these best practices have been shared with the other environmental regulators in other states. And so this is a good example of a management reform, or basically a internal, process reform you might have within a particular agency. And so I think that the Trump administration should probably be looking at adopting some kind of method like that already exists and applying it within agencies to identify waste and inefficiencies. The process that DOGE has spelled out and that Musk has talked about is just a little unclear as to how it's going to work. And it doesn't seem to be based on any pre-existing experience. So, maybe AI can uncover all these problematic areas that we didn't know about before, but maybe it's a better idea to try some process improvement strategies that have worked in other places. And I'd say Iowa's a pretty good example of that.
Yeah, and I know Iowa as well. We think of Javier Milei in Argentina. His famous video where he's shouting "afuera" as he deletes different agencies of the government there. But Kim Reynolds, governor of Iowa, signed a law in April 2023 to cut the number of cabinet agencies in Iowa from 37 to 16. They've really streamlined government there. They did the same thing in 2024. They signed another law that eliminated 83 different boards and commissions from the state government. So it can be done. It can be done right here in the United States. And I think that's part of what the federal government should be taking away from a lot of these experiences. And you can go talk to these people. They're more than happy to tell you what they did to make their states work better. One of the things about this, though, that has happened as well is these reforms, like the Iowa reform you mentioned, it was very successful at reducing the wait times for permits for environmental permits for projects. It was very successful at just making government work better and serve the public better. But it doesn't really save a lot of money. It doesn't really, it doesn't balance the budget. And I think one of the things that has been sort of conflated here with DOGE is that you can balance the budget and you can cut, crazy amounts of spending by simply reforming the bureaucracy. And, it's the same story in Idaho. These states have cut spending as well, but they've done that through other things. It wasn't because of these bureaucratic reforms. And I think people need to keep in mind that those are two separate goals.
Maybe I'll just add a couple of things to that, because those are all great points. And so I think what the Argentina example and the Iowa reforms that you just mentioned demonstrate is just the need for legislative action, and how really there's no substitute for it, because those both involved passage of laws. You can't delete a department unless it's something like DOGE that was created through an executive order. You could delete that, but you can't just delete entire departments like the Department of Education without action from Congress. And then, as we mentioned at the beginning, all the spending, if you want to tackle spending, you're going to have to go look at the entitlements and defense as well. And, interest is a major expense now as well. And that's really nothing we can do about that other than get spending under control now so we don't have more interest later. So there just isn't agreement really on regulatory reform or spending reform sufficient for major laws to be passed by Congress. But at some point, that's really the only way that we're going to get the kind of change that we all want to see, is if Congress steps up and makes the hard decisions that it's been kicking over the agencies for decades.
All right, perfect. This was a great conversation, James. Thanks so much for talking to us, and I hope somebody at the federal government is paying attention to what's going on at the states, and maybe they can learn something and make the federal government work better too. So in the past on Econception, we've talked about protectionism, tariffs, trade, and there was a recent event that seemed to give some vindication to protectionists, and I wanted to talk about that and what it really means. So I'm referring to Donald Trump's threat of tariffs against Colombia, the country in South America, over the fact that the president of Colombia had tried to reject military flights, United States military flights carrying migrants who were being deported back to Colombia. Trump threatened tariffs of 25% and then of 50% on all Colombian goods. And then the president of Colombia relented and allowed for the people to be repatriated. And this was seen as a huge win for Donald Trump. And it was seen as a vindication of tariffs because, after all, he said tariffs and he got what he wanted. So clearly this shows that tariffs work. Now, when we're thinking about this, it's important to note that we shouldn't really feel any sympathy for the president of Colombia here. He is a socialist president, not a good guy in general, very unpopular in Colombia, actually. And it would be better if someone else was in charge there from the United States point of view. What he was really trying to do was just grandstand for a global audience against Trump. And say what you want about Trump. If you're the more powerful country in this interaction, which the United States clearly is, you're not going to let that kind of thing go. And so there was some justification for a response from Trump. The question, though, is whether this was a good method to use to get what he wanted. I think there's a couple things that we need to consider when we're thinking about foreign policy and how it relates to trade. This one seems, first of all, just disproportionate to what actually happened. The dispute was really about which airplanes could be used to send a couple hundred people back to Colombia after being deported from the United States. There's no reason that it shouldn't have been the U.S. military planes that the president of Colombia objected to. But at the same time, this is not a massive problem. But it was treated as something that it was potentially worth blowing up the entire United States trading relationship with Colombia. Because Trump said tariffs on everything if you don't do what I want. Now, the United States has a trade agreement with Colombia. It was signed in 2006. It was part of a wave of trade agreements that the United States signed under the Bush administration with countries in Central America and South America. This was sort of building on the momentum from the trade agreements with Canada and Mexico that were started in the late 80s and completed in the mid 90s, with the goal of having a pretty well integrated Western Hemisphere free trade zone. These deals have been good for the United States. They've been good for the other countries that have signed them. But since the Bush administration, the U.S. government has been much less intentional about cultivating its commercial relationships in Central America and South America. Who has been very intentional about it has been China. And China is now a major trading partner with many of these countries. Now, the U.S. still is as well. But the U.S. should be seeking to build on that and to try to minimize Chinese influence. Because what China's offer is to a lot of these developing countries is basically, look, we will trade with you. We'll give you various kind of investments in your country. And as long as this is just a strictly business relationship, we're happy with that. We're not going to ask you any questions about how you do your government. We're not going to try to intervene at all in any of your decision making. We're just here to make money. We want you to get rich so that we can get rich. End of story. Now, the reason China does that, of course, is that they don't want those countries asking any questions about China's internal governance, which, being a communist dictatorship, is pretty bad. But for a lot of these countries, they look at the United States and they say, look, this is the richest country in the world. We'd love to do business with you. But if your politicians are going to fly off the handle at the slightest provocation and threaten us with tariffs and threaten to blow up our trading relationship, even though we have a signed agreement approved by both countries in place, then that's a harder sell than the Chinese offer of just business, no questions asked. The other problem with this is that Trump is, while this is claimed as like a strategic win, Trump has not been using this threat strategically at all. It's true that Colombia has a socialist president, but Panama has a right-wing president who's pro-American and was elected in 2024, the same year as Trump, on a promise to secure the border in Panama. Now, whatever that means for the people of Panama, it's also in the United States' interest, from Donald Trump's perspective, that Panama secure its border, because Panama is the country that connects Central America with South America. That land border on the southern border of Panama is one of the primary avenues through which migrants from South America make their way through Central America, through Mexico, into the United States. And so if Trump wants to get a handle on that, it would be good to have the president of Panama as a partner. The president of Panama has also been strong in his promises to crack down on drug trade as well, which has also been something that Trump has said he wants to do. So if he was truly using this tariff threat strategically, he would be cultivating the relationship with the president of Panama, but instead he's been threatening Panama as well with all sorts of consequences over an apparent desire to retake the Panama Canal for the United States. So now you've got a pro-American right-wing president in Panama who has to come out and disagree strongly with the right-wing president in America because he's threatening the sovereignty of his country. There's no strategy here. So the arguments for tariffs and protectionism under the theory that politicians will be very discriminating and act in the national interest in a consistent way, it doesn't hold up. Now, for people who want to argue for it based on the trade numbers and say trade deficits are bad, well, the United States has a trade surplus with Colombia and has every year since 2018. In every year since 2018, the United States has exported more to Colombia than it has imported from Colombia. This is supposed to be what protectionists think is a good thing, a trade surplus. But Trump is threatening tariffs on Colombia anyway. Then finally, there's the constitutional question, which is that it's not even clear that the president even has the power to impose tariffs on all goods from an entire country. The Constitution clearly gives the tariff power and the taxation power more generally to Congress. But Congress has passed a series of laws over many decades delegating a lot of that power to the president. But it's still subject to some constraints. And no president has really ever tried to do tariffs, to actually implement tariffs against an entire country unilaterally. And so it's hard to say exactly how that would shake out. It's certainly against the spirit of the Constitution, though, which is very clear that this is a power of Congress. And that opens up the question of, was this even a credible threat by Trump? If you don't actually have the power to do something that you're threatening to do, if you don't actually have the power or ability to do it, then it's not an effective negotiating strategy, because presumably the person you're negotiating with will know that. It certainly violates the trade agreement the United States has with Colombia. But international law is pretty sketchy and difficult to enforce. Constitutional law, though, is a little bit easier, and it might have been struck down in courts had Trump actually tried to go through with this. Now, of course, the whole point of this threat was to not have to go through with it. That was what a successful negotiation here would look like, and Trump can claim the win on that ground. But this does not prove that tariffs are overall a good idea, and Trump's ability to use them in the strategic manner that many of his supporters claim to advocate is still lacking in evidence. Another thing that lacks in evidence is the idea that the working class is primarily the base of the organized labor movement in the United States. We have this leftover idea from decades past that blue-collar workers on construction sites and behind the wheels of semi-trucks and on assembly lines in manufacturing plants are all union members, and that if you create government policies to help unions, those are the workers that you're helping. But the Bureau of Labor Statistics every single year puts out a report on union membership in the United States. And what it shows very clearly is that this is not true. So the first thing to know is that the union membership rate, so the percentage of workers in the U.S. who are in a union, who are union members, is 9.9%. It has been declining since roughly 1960. This particular report from the BLS has been put out every year since 1983, and it has declined almost every year since then, very steadily. It was 20.1% in 1983 when it first came out. It's 9.9% today. Just got down into single digits. Last year it was 10%. If you split up that number by private sector and public sector, you get a much better idea of who a union worker is in the United States. The private sector union membership rate is only 5.9%, so it's lower than the average. It also declined from 6% last year, so just a tick down. The public sector union membership rate, though, is 32.2%. So almost a third of government employees in the United States, and that includes federal, state, and local, almost a third of them are union members. But less than 6% of private sector workers, who are, of course, most workers in the United States, less than 6% of them are in unions. So right away, if you're doing something to help unions, a lot of the workers that you're helping most are workers for the government. If you break it down by the number, there are 14.3 million union members in the United States. And of those, 7 million are public sector workers. So basically about half of union members in the U.S. work for the government. So right away, if your picture of a union worker is a construction worker or a truck driver or a manufacturing worker, fully half of union members in the U.S. actually work for the government. They don't do any of that. They don't do any of that stuff. We know from other reporting that the Department of Labor does that the National Education Association, which is the country's largest teachers union, has 2.8 million members, and the American Federation of Teachers, the second largest teachers union, has 1.8 million members. So that means that 32% of all U.S. union members are in the two major teachers unions. So that's by far the largest group of people in the population of union members is teachers. Maybe you have an idea that union members are mostly male because these are male-dominated fields that people commonly associate with unions. But the union membership rate for men and women is basically the same. It's 10.2% for men and it's 9.5% for women. So it's slightly more for men, but not that different. If you break it down by age and sex, the most unionized group of workers in the U.S. is actually women between the ages of 45 and 54. The union membership rate for them is 13%. In general, there's a slight rise for union membership in older age groups relative to younger age groups. But the vast majority of workers in those blue-collar, male-dominated industries are not union members. So we can look at it by industry. 84.2% of transportation and warehousing workers are not in unions. 84.2%. 89.7% of construction workers are not union members. It's almost 9 out of 10 construction workers are not in unions. 92.2% of manufacturing workers are not in unions. So all that coverage about the United Auto Workers and the strike against Boeing last year by the machinists union and the idea that there's all of these manufacturing workers that are all union members, 92% of them are not in unions. And 93% of mining, quarrying, and oil and gas extraction workers are not union members. So those are pretty blue-collar, male-dominated fields, and the vast majority of workers in those are not union members. And so this image that we have of unions as the working class, what has actually happened over the past several decades is that unions have become primarily a professional class and government worker organization. And that's really where a lot of the growth is, too. One of the biggest growth areas for unions in recent years has actually been graduate students. As their membership has been declining among auto workers, United Auto Workers has branched out into graduate students, and about a quarter of their membership now comes from higher education. The UAW has about the same number of members in the University of California system as it has at General Motors. These organizations are allowed to do this. They can go to whatever industry they want and try to organize people, but they get a lot of mileage out of their history as groups primarily composed of working class people. And a lot of the public perception hasn't caught up to what they really are today. This BLS report comes out every year, and it's a good time to reflect on that. Now it's time for the paper of the episode. But before that, if you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and leave us a positive review wherever you get your podcasts. It helps us to know that you enjoy the show, and it makes the show more visible for others to start listening as well. I let James pick the paper of the episode. Well, it's really a book chapter, and it's from the 1972 book, Cost-Benefit Analysis, Selected Readings. It's by Martin Feldstein, and it's called The Inadequacy of Weighted Discount Rates. Here's James to tell you about it.
Sure. So one paper that I really am a fan of it's a book chapter actually by Martin Feldstein from 1972. It's called The Inadequacy of Weighted Discount Rates. So it sounds like kind of a wonky topic, but I'm a big regulatory nerd. I like cost benefit analysis, and one of the most important metrics in cost benefit analysis is the discount rate. And this is, I would say, one of the least understood topics in all of economics. And I would say it's one of the least understood issues in cost benefit analysis among conservatives in particular, who just will repeatedly say things that are inaccurate about discounting. And this book chapter, and Feldstein and other places, has other articles about social time preference discount rates that really very cleanly and nicely explain this concept in easy to understand terms and explain why discounting occurs in cost benefit analysis and why certain approaches to discounting are just wrong. And so I think many of listeners to this podcast, if you're at all interested in regulation or cost benefit analysis, you'd benefit from reading the work of Martin Feldstein on this topic.
The Inadequacy of Weighted Discount Rates by Feldstein. Read it. That's all for today. Remember, the economy is complicated and nobody has all the answers, but markets work.